informed me that somehow I did not have her name listed in the faculty with all of her information. So while she's lecturing, I'm going to go check that information out. And if that is indeed the case, then I'm going to be reading it to you so that you all know Adina's background and what she has to offer us. So my greatest apologies, my dear. Blame Mercury, okay?
I'm blaming it for everything lately.
Okay. I'll let Adina take it from here and introduce her subject to you.
Good afternoon. Everybody awake now after Kristen's talk, even though it was after lunch? One thing I've noticed with this group of people, we're all Pluto related in some way or another. But I've noticed it's a group of people more Sagittarius than any place else. So just for fun, raise your hand if you have a Sag sun. Okay. How about a moon? Ascendant? Okay, Pluto in the ninth? Okay, now, if you have any of those, or any planets in Sag, all hands up for any of those. How did that happen? You're a nothing. So, you know, we seem to be a Pluto-Sag group. My talk today is Jupiter and Sagittarius, the long and winding road. And what that relates to is, in our evolutionary journey, our ideas, our belief systems, basically, how they evolve as we evolve. It's a very long journey. It goes in 12-year cycles, Jupiter does. And that's how, in a way, we spiritualize in 12-year cycles too. No matter where you are, evolutionarily speaking, we're all still working our way back to God, so to speak. And so it'll happen in these 12-year cycles. Also, Pluto is going to be in Sag, sadly, only 3 more years. Yeah, because it's going into Capricorn afterwards. No offense to Stephen if he's here. January of 2008, it goes into Capricorn, and then it'll retrograde back out and go back into Sag in late November of 2008. So if we're going to get people exposed, we have 3 years left to do that. I believe Bush has about 3 years left to be exposed. There's still hope. Traditionally, Sag rules cosmologies, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, truth, higher learning. In evolutionary astrology, then what that equates to is the archetype within human consciousness that makes us aware that we're connected to something larger than ourselves and our immediate circumstances, which is Gemini. It makes us aware of the cosmos and the fact that there must be a truth, that explains the manifested creation. Think back to when you were a kid or whenever this happened, sitting out under the stars at night. When was the first time you kind of wondered how you fit into the whole scheme of things? Anybody remember?
I was 7 years old.
7?
When my brother died.
That's interesting. About 7 also is that first Saturn square where we realize we're actually here. Anybody else? 4? Okay, cool. As we ponder on these things, that's what really becomes the basis to wonder and speculate more about how we fit in there, as opposed to Gemini and just accumulating facts about about phenomenal reality, which is knowledge. Sagittarius seeks to understand the place that it has, not just something in your head, but it's more, to me, understanding is kind of a body, mind, and spirit thing. It incorporates the whole aspect of what we are. More of a visceral thing, by going from Gemini and through Virgo and kind of discerning different facts, moving up through Sag and relating to the phenomenal, or relating to the bigger picture. We get to that bigger picture eventually of Pisces, keeping in mind that Jupiter used to rule Pisces, so it contains that bigger picture. But now it's more like part of the picture for most of us. If we start with, I kind of look at it two ways. If we start with the Pisces and God projecting through Aquarius the manifested creation into time-space reality, and that's Capricorn. Then Sagittarius, with its need for freedom, wants to explore and move beyond that Capricorn, beyond the limitations, both inwardly and outwardly, to break free of the man-made beliefs and laws and relate to natural law. We want to experience more. That's the good part of the more of Sagittarius. It's our quest, really, for that something more. And I think of the words of Yogananda. I don't know, Jeffrey, if you had that in mind when you used that in Pluto 1. The quest for something else. Even though it's Pluto, Sag plays a part in that quest. When we do that, when we quest, part of that quest is for who we are naturally speaking, unconditioned, out of the Capricorn. When we do that, we become authentic and live with integrity. If we take it from the Scorpio, and that's something more, and of course, in a way, sometimes Sag has been given the bad rap of the grass is always greener, they always want more, nothing's ever good enough. Well, if we didn't want more and didn't see, the grass is always greener, if it's greener over here in this pasture, it might get us out of the Scorpio pasture with the cow patties in it. We might stand there forever, and some of us do. From time to time, we all do. So it really moves us out of where we can be stuck. The mutable signs will do that. When we ponder and contemplate, and those are words, Sagittarian words, speculate, we engage the right brain, the intuitive side of us. This isn't something that we think about. We ask the question, but then after that, the pondering is really a right brain thing, non-linear. And that's related to the inspiration of the source, God, goddess, whatever you want to call it, feel comfortable with, coming through us. We all have this ability. It's distinct from knowing, from the gathering of intellectual or sense information, but at the same time, it underlies the intellect. That makes sense to you? It's kind of like underneath everything else, it supports the thoughts that we have, and kind of it's how we make sense of those. It provides the concepts, the abstract principles to the linear, deductive thoughts of Mercury or Gemini. Now the challenge through Gemini and Mercury becomes explaining the concepts. I like to think of it as has anybody ever pinged their computer connection? If you know what I mean by pinging, you find out what the connection, if it's connected to another computer or making the information go from one place to another, and they're called packets. Where's Steve? He's not in here. And it'll give you the number of packets sent, the number of packets received, and the number of packets lost. Well, that's kind of the way the right brain, left brain works, is how many packets are getting through. When we have these concepts, And, all the pondering that we do, how can we explain it to others? Does that make sense to you? Anybody get tongue-tied? I do. I have Jupiter in Sag. So once we start that process of asking questions, let me back up a minute because there's another part of that. Anybody that's ever had a reading with Jeffrey, this is another part of the intuitive versus the intellectual, and highly evolved souls will speak in a way that's more intuitive. And you'll understand what they say to a certain point, and I know I've done this. I'll go back and listen to my tape a year later and go, that's what he meant. Because another thing unfolds. Listen again later, something else. So there's this knowledge that goes on and on and on. Anybody else have that experience with readings? Yeah. Once we start that process then of asking the questions and pondering and contemplating the larger questions, how we're connected, this is what forms the basis of our philosophy, religion, beliefs, metaphysical system that explains the connection. Within this, the nature of our perceptions, which determine what we think about and what we believe, are linked to our evolutionary condition and what we need in any given life to keep growing. If our soul's in a consensus state, then we're going to pretty much take in what the consensus says. That's where our beliefs are going to come from. And we're not, we'll just believe what we're told and act on that. Everything else will be filtered through those beliefs. If we're individuated and trying to break free of that, then we're going to need freedom to develop our own system, our own beliefs. We may go through a stage, this is where atheism can actually be a good thing. You kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater maybe for a while, but it's necessary maybe for you to let go of what was so you can move into something else. And then towards the end of that, you may hook up with more metaphysical types of systems, leading to the spiritual state, which is where we really we know that all true paths lead to the same place. So whatever point you are on the continuum of the evolutionary stages reflects the nature of our perceptions and beliefs, both individually and collectively, and the reasons for them. For being born into the United States, at least until now, has given us tremendous freedom to be, explore what we wanted to, be what we wanted to be, think what we want to think. That's being challenged now. Has anybody read some of the stories where people are kept out of Bush presentations? If you have a bumper sticker, a t-shirt, just a differing belief, just saying you disagree. You're not allowed to disagree. This is not new to this country, but new for this time. And, the way it's going right now, and the religious right, even, our beliefs and our religious beliefs could be challenged at some point. Within this, whatever constitutes the nature of our beliefs will determine our mindset, how we interpret reality to ourselves, both inwardly and outwardly, which in turn determines our attitude towards life, the meaning that we have for our life. For example, on an individual level, if I have Jupiter in Capricorn, I can feel, a real sense of futility and self-defeat. And, but because that's true for me, doesn't mean it's true for somebody else. Somebody else could be very self-confident, very self-determined within that same Jupiter and Capricorn. So both aspects are true, so to speak, but, relatively speaking, can be anywhere in there. At a collective level, I recently saw a TV program about, and I think it was the Maasai people, I don't know if anybody else saw this on PBS, who have been living in harmony with nature in Kenya for 400 years. Everything in their village was built around nature, built loosely speaking, because they're a tribal people. Incorporating the rivers, the trees, everything. And they had a very successful life if you look at it from a standpoint that they were prospering, they could feed everybody, everybody was well loved, everything just worked together, the whole ecosystem with these people. Now this is also real close to Mount Kilimanjaro, and since that has become more of an attraction both for tourists and climbers, it's been declared, that whole area has been declared a national park, and they forced these people out of their own land. But the point is, they had a belief system, obviously, that was very much natural law, and they lived in harmony with it. It broke my heart. I started to cry when I saw this, because they really had a better idea what the world was about than we do in all the big cement cities, By the same token, we've got the religious right. Is anybody familiar with the Left Behind series of books? Raise your hand if you are. Has anybody read any of them? No, I haven't either. I read a few excerpts. They're Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. And Tim LaHaye, I believe, is a minister. These are a series of 13 books, some of which have made the New York Times bestseller list. And they're about the end times, Armageddon, and what happens to the people. Some of them are going to go up in the rapture and be taken away, and the rest of us are left behind if we don't believe the way the religious right believes. And some of the explanations they give are absolutely gruesome. Like Jesus is going to come back and zap people so that their skin melts off. This is disgusting. Their skin melts off of them, they crumble in bones, and and people are reading this and really believing it. So you see the underpinnings of those two very different belief systems and what happens. I also recently heard on NPR, yes, evolution is back in Kansas. We all know they talk creationism only, and they're now teaching evolution again. So if we look at, what was that?
She, their life.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're going to let the rest of us know it. And yet, see, I live in Ohio, and they're debating about eliminating the teaching of evolution in the schools. I don't know if anybody else's schools are or not, but yeah, it's frightening. If we really look at what a belief is, it's just a mental acceptance and conviction in truth, the actuality or truth of something. It's just trust that something's true or right. That, to me, suggests more of a cerebral type of thing. In the phenomenological world, a belief or truth can be easier to pin down. It's like years ago when people believed the earth was flat. Obviously it wasn't, but this is something very provable. When we get into more abstract concepts and what God is about, it's a little harder to pin down. And so this is where some of that discrepancy comes from too, in people's understanding. But a belief is really just a springboard. We all have to start somewhere with a belief in something, and then it can lead to other things, rather than just the mental concept. If we look at it as a springboard and how it evolves and grows, eventually it goes beyond that mental thing to the concepts and experience, and it's through experience that it can become faith. So belief's just really the beginning. One of the challenges, of course, related to our beliefs is to generalize them and think that ours are the only ones. You know, like we know EA is the only astrology, right? But in that case, we're right. And for the Billy Graham archetype, see, I can get up here and go, okay, we'll try to convince and convert others. Another challenge is to think that a belief is somehow true or the truth. If we look at beliefs or truth as a continuum, like here, yes, you know, here's a podium, this is a podium, that's true, and on up to the other end of it, we can prove at one end it does conform to fact or reality. At the other end of the continuum, we find truth with a capital T, when that's considered to be the supreme reality, to have ultimate meaning and value of existence. So we can see in between those two endpoints, you know, what a variety of truth there can be, how relative it can be, relativity through that opposition to Gemini, and the sextile, or not opposition, yeah. And we've got the sextile to Libra. Wasn't Gemini, was it? Think of the Libra. I have Uranus squaring my Jupiter Sun right now, so if the words don't come out right. So all those degrees of truth lie somewhere in between, and that too is part of our journey to determine, you know, at certain intervals, how we go. Even the absolute truth, what we call the absolute truth right now, the totality, we can't know totally in human form. The avatars may know it when they're not in this world, but even they have certain veils that they can't see, you know, when they're in this world, let alone try to explain it to people. So they can be part of universal truths or principles, these relative truths. Whether we're tapped into them consciously or not, they're still there. So what we conceptualize as truth, from the answers to our contemplations and ponderings, leads to beliefs that serve as the underpinnings then of our religious, philosophical, metaphysical, or cosmological system. These beliefs, again, color how we interpret our reality and give meaning to our lives. Anybody with a lot of Sag knows life has to have meaning. You know, it does. It's how we really make sense of ourselves and our lives. Whatever beliefs and interpretations give meaning to our lives really are hard to part with, as our sense of meaning and security is dependent on those. And again, we need that sense of meaning. So if we give up the beliefs that give our life meaning, where does that leave us? You know, think about that for a minute. One belief that's really precious to you, if you would give that up, where would you be? What would happen? And you can see why we grasp so much to hang on to our beliefs. There is this neat little movie called Dogma. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. Yeah, Own It, yes. It's a great little movie. And it is all about dogma, particularly Catholic dogma. Picture, if you will, George Carlin as a Catholic bishop who has decided that the church is in trouble because he shows the crucifix. He says, look at this is not pulling in people. So they have a new statue, Buddy Christ. What's that? The Buddy Christ. I think he's like this or something, and winking. That's going to get them more people. But they're having this big celebration, and anybody who comes to this celebration and goes through the arches is supposedly forgiven of anything they've done. Okay? And we'll go back to heaven. Well, there are two fallen angels, Loki and Bartleby, played by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Loki was the one who used to be the angel of death and would zap everybody, but he got tired of it. He just thought that wasn't the thing to do. Plus, his friend Bartleby talked to him. He says, this really isn't a good thing, even though God told you to do it. So he gave it up, and he got thrown out of heaven. So they're going to go through these arches to get back in, because the last thing Jesus said was, anything you hold true on earth, I will hold to in heaven. And here's where the dogma comes in. So they're going to go through. At the same time, if they make it through, the world will disappear, because God is infallible. They'll prove God is fallible, and the world would just disappear. So the whole idea is to save, keep these two fallen angels from getting back into heaven. And it's quite an interesting story, but you can see what happens with this dogma and the trouble that can happen, and the strange beliefs we have connected to these types of things, and then how people act on them, because it became kind of bloody. But I would recommend you see it. It wasn't really bloody, but it is really a fun movie to watch. And I don't want to spoil the end for you, but you'll find out who God is. Shh. But I think, and one thing too, there is the 13th disciple, Rufus, played by Chris Rock, who who had talked to the last scion, which is a woman, who is, the last living relative of Christ, so to speak. She's Roman Catholic, and he asked her about her beliefs, and she was on the fence and stuff and saying something about beliefs. And he said, I like to think of them as ideas. Beliefs are harder to change. So, but it's cool. I'd recommend it. So as we make our journey through our beliefs and how we're interpreting reality, we'll necessarily attract confrontation, just like in the movie, through the Gemini-Mercury opposition, or through disillusioning, the square to Pisces-Neptune, so that we, related to whatever it is we believe in, so we can re-examine them and change them. How many of you have not been confronted about a belief and found it or disillusioned? And either one really is difficult. And yet, how we grow because of either that disillusioning or the confrontation, we go, wow, I was really stuck in that. I'm glad I'm not anymore. So as Pluto's been transiting Sag, I think we've seen at least a couple neat things, and that's the increase in the study of metaphysics, alternative spiritual systems, which we see in magazines, books, workshops. We've seen an increase in the number of books and workshops dedicated to increasing and recovering our own intuitive capacities, which is a wonderful thing. Breaking away from the man-made beliefs and learning to trust ourselves again, especially at this transition of the ages. But we still have to keep in mind there are different stages of intuition, just like there are different evolutionary stages, and they're really linked, together and follow along with each other. I think we'd agree that the intuition of a George Bush is certainly different than the intuition of a Yogananda. That's that you can see again the big, the huge continuum there of what it is. And really the simplest way to access your intuition, really the way we all start, is simply by asking a question and waiting for the answer to come in. And it does, whether it's immediate or somewhere down the line, the answer will come. And of course there's other ways to do that too as we grow. At the same time though, during the Pluto transit, as we've seen all these people, there's a group of us expanding and growing and going beyond. We still have in this society anyway, the religious right and the other patriarchal religions that really, I think, continue to create God in their image rather than the other way around. I think we've seen that over thousands of years. Rian Eisler, who wrote The Chalice and the Blade, which is one of the most excellent books in my opinion, in my Gemini opinion, on history, actual history, and then she also goes into what we can do now at this point in time to help evolve that history, out of that history. She says, religion supports and perpetuates the social organization it reflects. Religion supports and perpetuates the social organization it reflects. So again, we're seeing the extreme ramifications of that, not just, here in the religious right, but, through Islam and that whole thing. As Jeffrey pointed out in Pluto 2, the last transit of Pluto in Sagittarius correlates to the Renaissance and the move into humanism. And this current Pluto in Sag transit correlates more from humanism to Gaia consciousness, Earth consciousness, the goddess. So, there always has to be an involution before an evolution. That's what we're in now. We'll talk about that a little more with the yugas, the transition of the ages, and why it is so difficult to make that transition. People tend to hang on as hard as they can when things are changing. And we've had so much change with women's issues, African American issues, gay rights, all these things, to the point where, the established religions are going, hey, wait a minute, and grasping even harder to hold on to what they thought they had, what they think they have, but it can't last forever. So on an individual level, this is the first chart of how our beliefs influence our lives. This is a male, white, born in lower economic conditions, Methodist religious conditioning. But, as an adult, he wasn't that involved in the church, but those were the kind of underpinnings. He was a middle child between two sisters, and the older sister was considered the baby of the family even as an adult. His father worked for Railway Express, so that he was gone 3 days at a time and home 3 days at a time. His mom was home all the time. She ran a beauty shop out of her house, so she was home all the time. And a very, very strong woman. His whole family comes from a Germanic background and actually came over just 2 or 3 generations back, I think it was. Also, and these are all pertinent to what, his whole life. His mother was a Pisces, and I guess her way of dealing with that, as we know, we can over-identify with something when we have a lot of Pisces, is she took diet pills for 20 years. And this wasn't so that she could lose weight, it was so she could eat and not put on weight. And so obviously it did something to her mental stability. Very forceful woman. So with the Pluto in the 4th house, and can everybody see that okay? You can see his evolutionary intent is really to learn the inner security and take responsibility for his own actions and create a whole new self-image. His philosophy of life, let's see, did I put, oh, okay, 3rd stage consensus, I forgot to give you that part, but I think he's bordering on 1st stage individuated, because he's breaking, he's not really into any kind of religion, yet that underpins it. But he's not into anything else either. He has more of a philosophy of life. And that philosophy boils down to one thing. You have to look out for number one, because nobody else is going to. Now, this isn't from a standpoint of being self-sufficient and self-reliant. It was a standpoint, I come first, everybody else comes afterwards, which is really odd when you, in a way, when you look at, see if I can work this little thing. The 7th house emphasis, plus the Libra emphasis. And yet, he had this thing about him. He came first. Okay? The other thing that was most important to him was, and partially because of his background, which of course came from prior life too, was to establish his authority and have a social position. Social position was very, very important to him, and money. Those were his driving forces. You can see with that Gemini in the 2nd, he probably, and it's in conjunct with Jupiter in Scorpio in the 7th, all that Scorpio right there, that he probably had some lifetimes of real destitution, physical, emotional. And so, the money became the thing, and especially when you're in a consensus state. This is, where you put your value is in this type of deal. And let's see here. So he's with the Saturn in the 4th, along with the Pluto. It was real important, and he did a good job of actualizing a career. He became a CPA. And so he got that down, pretty good. That rules his 10th house. But it's, bisextile, the Jupiter, which then sextiles the MC, and it rules the 8th house, so you can see the resources there involved. And what he did was marry a woman whose father was a CPA, and he ended up inheriting the family business. So this was a relationship then built on what he could get out of it. So he's, again, put himself number one. The status that he thought, because her family knew people in the town in which they lived, and to him this was a big deal. He had the connections he needed, he had the wealth he needed. And he eventually ended up inheriting that business. Even though the brother of the woman was in the business, he left because he couldn't stand this guy. So he ended up with something that was not initially his. In addition, the Jupiter in Scorpio is conjunct the South Node and square the Saturn. Pluto in the 4th rules the South Node, and the Jupiter and Mars in Leo conjunct Pluto and square the Venus in Scorpio. And Mars also semi-squares Uranus and the Gemini in the 2nd, and the Jupiter ruling the Sag moon on the 8th. So you can see there's been a lot of wounding to him in prior lifetimes. Loss, abandonment, abuse, betrayal issues. A lot of these came from the devouring mother archetype, if you consider all that I just said, and also that Gemini opposes the Juno in the 8th. Now keep in mind this would work both ways. He could be the one that was doing the wounding or be wounded. But considering the family he was born into this lifetime with a very, very dominant mother who pretty much ruled the home, he watched his father be controlled by the mother, and so he was very determined that that would not happen to him. It really didn't matter what anybody said to him. I mean, he just knew he was going to be controlled, and so he wasn't going to let it happen. So he's, in a way, he has this castration complex through those symbols as well. So I'll get you, I'll take care of you before you get me. You're not going to do anything to me. You following all this? Okay. There would have been betrayal also by business partners. We look at the 7th house. Lovers, friends, we have Jupiter in conjunct the Uranus. In all fairness, some of this loss or feelings of being abandoned could also come from lifetimes with that Pluto-Saturn conjunction, and then Saturn square the Jupiter, of political and social upheavals where he lost family members, lost somebody close to him. But, depending on where you are, you can still feel abandoned. So it generated a lot of insecurity and a need to create security, and then, these are the ways then he creates it or thinks he does within himself through the social standing and the money, not realizing, at least in this evolutionary stage, that isn't what creates the inner security. The other way he did that, and we have the Libra in the 6th house, the Libra Sun and Neptune, and I don't know if I'm allowed to mention this, but I'm going to. Lucifer sandwiched in between the two of those. He was the silver-tongued devil. Trust me, I know what you need. And so he also, that's in the 6th house, and keeping in mind that even Sag can bear that feeling of lack and not being good enough. Affairs were the way, he filled up that lack or tried to prove himself. He also has the Mars in Leo square the Venus in Scorpio. So it's like the notches on the belt syndrome. If I do this, it was a way he made himself feel better about himself, realizing that, that just isn't it. I mean, someday this will all come back to haunt him, but in the meantime. And within that, with all the Sag moon ruled by the Jupiter, he had an absolute need to be right. Something could be black and white, and he'd tell you just the opposite. He was very invested in that. So the marriage ended, when the wife found out about the latest affair, which happened to be her best friend, and his response was, "I'm not having an affair, and you won't tell me who to see." Okay. So that's kind of a way to look at it from a consensus viewpoint, and yet starting to break out of that, not being dominated by, he wasn't in church every Sunday, but there were those beliefs underlying him. Okay, the second one. Okay, this is a white female, middle to upper middle economic conditions, raised Methodist and then Episcopalian, and third stage individuated. Her father was third stage consensus, mother was first stage spiritual. She has an older brother. She currently really doesn't have a religious or spiritual practice, although she's been involved in Wicca. She's a very natural person, very, very attuned to nature with her Neptune and Sag. So if anything, she's going to follow that type of path, along with maybe some ritual because of the Jupiter and the Scorpio. See how we're doing time-wise here. Her basic philosophy is to follow your heart and to be kind to others. To her, it doesn't take any kind of belief system to simply be a good human being and do for other people and try to be the best that you can be. She likes to do her own thing, Leo. And she's an artist who is very aware that the talent that she possesses is not her own. When she sits down and does any kind of artwork, and she really doesn't start with a preconceived notion of what's going to happen. She just lets it happen, and it's really cool. When she tries to direct it, it goes haywire. She's now gotten to the point where she's doing some commissioned work, and that's much more difficult for her because she has to direct it a certain way that people want it, and yet she still knows the talent itself does not belong to her. She's simply the channel. So you can see with that Jupiter and Sag, she too has, loss and abandonment issues, but this will play out very differently due to the position, the evolutionary condition, that type of thing. She comes from a standpoint or a belief with the Jupiter is opposing the Saturn and then conjunct the Moon. She had a fear coming into this life of getting too close to people because she would lose them. Okay, especially the mom. And then again, through abandonment and betrayal issues as well, or feeling betrayed because she had lost the mom or the parents. And this is a better idea of how these things kind of evolve. is that her first Jupiter opposition, oh, I should back up. When she was real little, when she first came into this life, she did not want to be held, cuddled in any way. And this was something she had to work out. She and her mother had to work out together because of issues of being lost to each other from prior lifetimes. And this fear of hers, if she got too close to people, she'd lose them. So she didn't want to be held. But at the first Jupiter opposition, she would allow herself to be held and cuddled by the mom. When she wasn't allowed to be rocked when she was a baby, now she wanted to be rocked. She was like about 6 years old. But it was like, okay, she had to build up that trust with the parents before she could actually allow that to happen again. This was also the time that Jupiter opposite Saturn in the third, she wanted to learn to read. It was in between kindergarten and first grade. So her mom sat and read with her, taught her to read, and she knew some before she went to first grade and really loved it. When transiting Jupiter, when she was in the third grade, transiting Jupiter was conjunct her natal Mercury in Virgo in the 6th house, and square the Jupiter, Neptune, and in conjunct the moon in Gemini, which is ruled by the Mercury. Well, that's the natal. You can see with the Mercury retrograde, she's taken in a lot of information in prior lifetimes, been overly curious. Now we come down and we've got Saturn in Gemini, the moon in Gemini, and, how does that all fit? But that, we've got those aspects back up to the Jupiter, the opposition and the inconjunct. And with the Neptune and Jupiter in the 9th, this is somebody who really needs to cut out all the outside information, be her own teacher, or have somebody who teaches from within, if she gets to that point. That makes sense to you? And so what happened to her, and this is really bizarre, and it was only in looking back on it that this could be seen. She had a teacher who really, she had two teachers. One she got along just famously with, and this is kind of a wild little kid. I mean, she doesn't fit in anybody's mold and never did, probably never will, much to her credit. But her reading teacher had the girl's older brother, who was very, just laid back and very different kind of person. She kept comparing this girl to her brother. Also, if something wasn't done exactly right and exactly on time, the punishment far outweighed the crime. Like, you didn't fill out this paper right, so you're going to stand in the hall. I'm going to call your mother. I'm going to, till she had this girl terrified. And the parents eventually had to move her into a different reading group because she was sick to her stomach. She didn't want to go to school. This was a child who really loved school and loved to read. After that year, she couldn't stand reading, unfortunately. But yet, in a way, it was a way of saying, okay, cut down the outside information, in a very bizarre type of way. She's very bright. She actually graduated from college magna cum laude. So, but the reading or taking out, she really started to become her own teacher and to live more through her experiences. This was really a watershed year for this kid. At the same time, she was terrified that her mother wouldn't come home, this irrational fear that her mother would not come back if she was out somewhere, or that she would die. And to the point that one time her mother was like 15 minutes late getting home. She called her grandmother because she didn't know how to do this. She called the highway patrol to find out where her mom was. That's how terrified she was. Now, and this goes back again to those prior lifetimes of losing parents and that fear coming into the life, getting over it, and now it's come back at her again, right with this transit. She had a dream at that time that her mom had died, but came back to her as a ghost and said, I will always be here with you. And Jupiter conjunct that Neptune. And the fear left. She knew from that point on, no matter where her mom was, she'd have contact with her. Isn't it neat how these things unfold? When Jupiter conjuncted the Venus and squared her Neptune, or with that, Jupiter squared, yeah, easy for me to say. and Jupiter square the Venus in Leo. It's a little wide, but the Neptune too, so I use them together. I'm a Sag, I do the wide orb thing. She also had a belief that she had to be sexual in order to attract or hold a partner. And she is heterosexual. So every relationship she started, she sexualized immediately. And that part of that was due to the lack of confidence. Even though she's got the Leo, it's in the 6th house. So underneath is this, yeah, I deserve it, but I don't feel like it, but part of me does. It's kind of a back and forth type of thing with her. At her 2nd Jupiter return, she finally realized what she had been doing, the pattern to her behavior. The boyfriend she was living with at the time, and most of the men were not emotionally available to her. And that's when she realized, what she'd been doing, why she'd been doing it. And she moved out, actually went to teach English in a foreign country at the same time, Jupiter in the 9th. And, but she left that belief behind. But she had to realize what it was that was, causing that behavior in the first place. And that was, like I say, at the 2nd Jupiter return. When Jupiter then moved into her 10th house, following that, she met the man who's now her husband, who happens to be a Sag. And so she started that relationship very, very differently. Friends first. We'll do this other part later. Go from there. They have, even though she's got Pluto in the 7th there, they have one of the most equal relationships I think I've ever seen. They both work, and both of them do stuff around the house. They do their own laundry. They both cook. They both everything. Nobody's jealous if the other one's gone. It's really neat to see a young couple who can do this kind of thing these days and show maybe the rest of us how to do this. In 1999, transiting Jupiter was in Aries, in conjunct her natal Jupiter, and she all of a sudden had this overwhelming fear of death. She didn't think she'd make it to 28. I mean, she was really, really scared, and went through a past life regression. And her Saturn return, this didn't take place at the same time, because her Saturn return was actually 2 years after that. They did a past life regression, and she went back to a lifetime as an artist in New York City. She's an artist now, but her art career hadn't really, she was hedging. Oh, I'm not good enough, I want to do it, that type of thing. Well, in this prior lifetime, she had been mugged in New York City. Her wrists had been slashed. The doctors couldn't do anything about it. She lost the use of her hands and died of starvation. Once she recovered that, that's when her art took off. So see how important these past lives are, because it was really an irrational fear for anything in this lifetime, and yet she needed to get beyond that point in order to move forward with what she's to be doing. Children are not something she wants to do this life, and I would support that, because I think maybe she needs to do the art thing and kind of do her own thing this lifetime. How much time do we have left? Oh, boy. Okay, I was going to do a third one, but can you skip the next one, Stacy, please? Because I really want to go into the United States stuff. 20 minutes. Yeah, let's just go to that one. We're going to skip. Okay. That one's fine. Thank you. On a more, a wider level here, as far as countries and societies and the Jupiter intention. Most of the original colonies were founded for 2 reasons: wealth or religion. And I was talking to Vernon this morning about this. I don't know if I thought I had a good American history teacher. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Well, we were taught that it was religious freedom that the Puritans, Pilgrims were after in moving to this country. Well, they wanted freedom from the Church of England, but they wanted to do their own thing. So it goes way beyond just freedom of religion, and we'll get a little more into that. But Virginia was founded mainly for wealth, and secondly for to convert people to Christianity. Massachusetts colony was really the one that was founded for the religious issues. Maryland was for Roman Catholics because they were being persecuted. Rhode Island was where Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams that's where they went after they were banished from Massachusetts because, God forbid, Anne Hutchinson, thought that God was accessible to everybody, which was heresy. So out she went. And Roger Williams, too, he wanted the separation of church and state. And so Rhode Island was the first to guarantee that. Connecticut was more for the financial. Pennsylvania, there was the Quakers, and they were ones, too, that even though they had their own belief system, they really opened it up to being freedom of religion for everybody. I'm going to skip that, Jamestown. If you want to know more about Jamestown and the first slave ship, Vernon Robinson, who's a current EA student, is doing some amazing work with the first slaves that were brought over to this country. But this is the Salem, Massachusetts chart, as close as I could get it anyway from the research that I did. And if we go back to the religious issues and the Puritans seeking to reform the Church of England, they wanted to reform it from within and weren't really getting anywhere there, so they first moved to the Netherlands, and then they were afraid their kids were becoming too Dutch, so they moved back to England, and then Salem was the first settlement in America. Then the Massachusetts Bay Company formed the other ones, and within a period of like to 1940, 10 years, they had 22 settlements. The General Court in Boston ruled the colony and set the standards for the religious and civil governments. But the Puritans looked at Massachusetts as the promised land that God had set apart for an experiment in Christian living. They described it as a city upon a hill with the eyes of all people upon them. I want to read this part. It says, it was their intent to establish a model community, a Bible commonwealth, based upon what the scriptures revealed of God's intent, a society centered on a community of saints, God's elect. Okay, look at this. Jupiter in Aquarius. Let's see where we are in the 6th. It rules the 5th. It squares Neptune in Libra and opposes the moon in Leo in the 12th, which is biquintile the Mars in Pisces in the 8th and biquintile Neptune in Libra in the 3rd. God's elect, God's chosen people. That's pretty graphic. The individual's needs were subordinate to the community needs, not in the sense of communes as we know them now, and everybody living together and supporting each other and for each other, but imposing. There was a total imposition, an unbending orthodoxy. Look at Uranus in Virgo in conjunct Jupiter in Aquarius, and square the Venus and Mercury in Aries in the 9th, which opposes the Saturn and Libra in the 3rd. Plus we've got Jupiter square the Neptune. Okay? Total unbending orthodoxy of belief and behavior upon every member. It wasn't confined to the church and religious matters, but also people were expected to follow it, that in their family relations they would be authoritarian and unbending. Business dealings, hardworking and thrifty, and even recreation, was limited. So they really weren't fighting for religious freedom when they opposed the church, They were fighting for the right to replace the church, the authority of the Church of England with their own authority. And this is something I did not know. Democracy, religious toleration, and separation of church and state were equally distasteful to the ruling elders. This is another interesting part. In creating the government, now this was Winthrop who did this, and keep in mind this rules over Salem as well. The small group of church leaders began with a stipulation in their charter that the freemen or stockholders of the company should make all laws for governing the colony and elect a governor, deputy governor, and 18 assistants, a chairman and board of directors to execute the laws and preside between the quarterly meetings of the shareholders. This was fairly standard procedure for business corporations, then as now. But this company was attempting to adapt the structure of an economic institution to purposes for which it wasn't intended, the actual government of a colony. Does this sound familiar? In this day and age, is all of this sounding familiar? Now, I have it on good authority that our lovely friends Bush, Cheney, Ashcroft, and Karl Rove were part of Salem, part of the Puritans, but especially Salem. So that's why when we look at this chart, the unbending orthodoxy and belief, God's chosen people, Messiah complex, the national identity. If we look at the sun in a mundane chart, the sun in Taurus in the 9th, conjunct Pluto in Taurus in the 10th, and square the moon, and then square the Jupiter. National identity, the experiment, Aquarius, for the benefit of the rest of humanity. And if we see those kind of ideals, if you put Pluto in that 10th house in Taurus, and we had Jamestown, during the founding of these early colonies, Pluto was in Taurus all the way. And, of course, so no ability to see beyond their own little immediate world. But look at that, claiming of the land itself through that Pluto and Taurus in the 10th, and the establishment of the authority, the absolute authority, through the inconjunct to the Saturn, and done through religion. And we've got the same thing going on now. I remember one time hearing Stephen Forrest say about Taurus, Taurus has the ability to be wrong, but never in doubt. I love the way he put that. And you see that again. If we bring that up then to the U.S. chart, which should be the next one, Stacy. Okay. I'm going to try to do the comparisons here because it's stunning. Oops. There we go. The Jupiter, you can't do two at one time. Do you have these in your packet? I think, if you remember, the Jupiter in the Salem chart was at 6 degrees of Aquarius, right on the south node of the U.S. chart. Okay? Then we've got, in the U.S.'s chart, of course, the Jupiter and the Sun and Venus all in Cancer. If we look to the polarity point of that for just a minute, the way I look at that Jupiter coming through the 8th house in Capricorn, but we've got Sag on the cusp, is what we really need to do is embrace a vision of social responsibility and shared resources. Jupiter also rules that 7th house. That would be the best use of that Jupiter there. Jupiter in Cancer in the 2nd tends to really narrow down that vision. It's really invested in its own belief system. You've got the frog in the well, and you've got the past with the Jupiter. I mean, it could be a really good thing. The north node of Jupiter is at 8 degrees of Cancer. So if we would embrace that polarity point, think of how we could, recreate the Jupiter that it is now. We're not doing that, obviously, but that would be the intention. The transiting Pluto is squaring Neptune. And look at the drug, let's see, all the drug regulations that keep people from getting the drugs that they need at a reasonable price. The social issues, we're cutting back on welfare to people who really need it at the same time that there are fewer jobs and fewer people. There's more poor people than before, and yet they're going to cut back, or they've been cutting back and will cut back more on help for people who really, really need it. We've also got the transiting Pluto opposite the Mars. We know what that's about with the wars, and I really, by the ingress chart, if we get to it, I look for us to do something with either Iran or Syria within the next year. I don't think this is going to stop here. But the media suppression, we've got the opposition between Pluto and Mercury retrograde in the natal chart, and at the same time, it's by transit, it's in conjunct the Mercury and opposing the Saturn, which is at least now moved beyond some of that Cancer. But look at the media suppression and the propaganda, and how often in the past, I know I used to hear this as a kid and even later about other countries like Russia, and they're not being told the truth. Everything they have is propaganda. Those people really don't know what's going on in their own country. We don't have any less propaganda than Russia did back when, and that's getting worse as well. Currently, transiting Neptune is starting to, it's conjunct the midheaven and the moon, and there again we've got the social issues and the trauma that it's causing to some people, with, like I say, the poor people, or the lack of health insurance, and that's like a Neptune Virgo type of thing. Pluto's also squaring our Neptune, the natal Neptune in this chart. Such a wealthy country, and we're not taking care of people. It's really bizarre. Education-wise, more and more states, for instance, Ohio, more states are providing money for their schools as they're cutting back at the federal level, and yet they don't have it. And I just found out recently in Ohio that we're still based on dividing it up by where you live, the property taxes, which is unconstitutional, and yet that's still happening as well. But what better way to control people than to keep them poor and ignorant? That's what we're doing. We're down to that. As far as I have an ingress chart, and that you didn't have in the election. We covered the ingress a little bit with as far as what's going to be happening. See if I don't find that. Okay, we got it there. We've got wrong one. The 12th house there, the continuation of keeping everything hidden, keeping it from view. I want to find it here because I had a few notes. And the Mars, that relates back to the same thing too. Mars in the 10th, ruling the north node. We've got Jupiter there on the south node. And that, I believe, was 23, is conjunct the natal Saturn of the U.S. chart. And we have the gay issues right now, too, with that, and the family stuff. And as far as what is a family, look at the Mars opposite the Saturn, and the Jupiter there, square that, and the family values, and whose family? Does a family have to have a mom and a dad? We're arguing that little piece of information too, as to what constitute a family and whose values they are, and disallowing people who truly care about each other to provide a family unit in the way the rest of us would like to. But with that Mars-Saturn opposition, doesn't look too promising. To wrap it up in these last few minutes, I ran the Jupiter return at the last minute. The last Jupiter return for the United States was August 9th, 2001. And that's where we had, I'm sorry you don't have a copy of this. Pluto and Mars are in Sag in the 5th house. And Pluto was in conjunct the Venus. But it's ruled by a Jupiter, the Jupiter at 5 Cancer, if you can picture this, conjunct the North Node in Cancer. And it's also conjunct Venus. So we have North Node, Jupiter, Venus, and Cancer in this Jupiter return in the 12th house, and it squares the moon in Aries. If you got that pictured with the square. And think of how the self-image of the United States changed just after this with the bombing of the Twin Towers. Also, with Jupiter rules the Pluto and Mars in Sag, and it's opposing Saturn in Gemini in the 11th, and it quintiles Uranus in Aquarius in the 8th. And think of the collective trauma to this country. All of this right after a Jupiter return. And at the time of this, Bush, of course, was on vacation. But that forever changed, our national identity. Or the sun, Mercury there in Leo, was changed forever, and that was opposing the Uranus. When you look at the 12th house with the North Node, Jupiter, and Venus in this Jupiter return, we go back to the Holy War because the Jupiter rules the Mars and the Pluto in Sag. So it was really kind of a setup for what's going on. Pluto was also opposing Saturn at that time. I wish I held more hope. The next election, Pluto will be on the U.S.'s 8th house cusp, exactly. So we can conjecture. But, all of this happens at a transition of the ages. Rhiannon Eisler, in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, covers this very nicely, again, like we talked earlier, about how at major transitions, when things are happening rapidly like they have been with people, and we've made such progress for so many different segments of people in this country, and then the people who are in power, whose belief systems are rooted differently, they dig in their heels, and won't give up. I would really recommend the book. She comes up with 2 words, androcracy, which derives from Greek words andros and kratos, and that she uses to describe a social system ruled by force or the threat of force by men. We all know language affects how we interpret things too, and how we understand things. So think of this instead of maybe patriarchy and matriarchy, androcracy or geilenny, which is for woman and man together. The L kind of links the two of them. so that we end up with both parts of humanity being equal, working together instead of having one over another. I'll leave you with a thought from Mahatma Gandhi. When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. Thank you very much.